Commander Vethal had written war reports for 31 years. He had assessed 42 species across 9 star systems. He had watched empires rise and collapse from the cold comfort of his command chair. His reports were clean, precise, and always correct. The Concord trusted his judgment more than they trusted their own generals. So when the Galactic Concord sent him to observe the humans, Vethal was not worried. He was, if anything, mildly bored. Humans had only had faster-than-light travel for about 40 years. They had 3 active colonies outside their home system. Their ships were small and loud and burned fuel in ways that made Concord engineers quietly embarrassed on their behalf. On paper, they were a young species, energetic, expanding, and completely unaware of how small they truly were in a very large and dangerous galaxy. Vethal's mission was simple. Watch them. Assess their military strength. Write a report. Recommend whether the Concord should invite them to the table or simply make sure they never became a problem. He expected to be done in 2 weeks. He parked his cloaked observation ship above a human military installation on a planet called Earth, in a region the humans called the American Southwest. It was a dry, dusty place, with a big sky and pale yellow land that stretched for miles. Vethal settled into his observation chair, activated his long-range visual sensors, and watched. The first thing he noticed was the noise. Concord military bases were quiet and orderly. Soldiers moved in neat formations. Everything had a place. Everything had a time. Efficiency was sacred. But this human base was loud. There was music playing from somewhere. Not formal music, chaotic music, with heavy repeated sounds that one of Vethal's crew members described as rhythmically aggressive. 2 soldiers near a vehicle were laughing so hard that one of them had to lean against the wall to stay standing. 3 others sat in the shade, eating something from small bags and throwing the empty bags at each other. Vethal turned to his second-in-command, Sub-Commander Zelith. "Is there a celebration happening?" he asked. Zelith checked her scanner. "No, sir. This appears to be a standard Tuesday." Vethal looked back at the screen. A soldier had just drawn a face on the side of a large explosive device. Not a threatening face, a smiling face, with small dots for eyes. Another soldier saw it, and pointed, and laughed. Vethal wrote his first field note. Subject species appears to suffer from a collective behavioral disorder. Recommend further observation before any formal engagement decision. He kept watching. The afternoon brought a training drill. This was more promising. The soldiers lined up, received instructions from a large, loud human who appeared to be in charge, a sergeant, according to Vethal's translation software, and began a series of physical exercises. They ran. They climbed things. They crawled through mud. Vethal leaned forward slightly, because this at least looked like military activity. Then the weapons portion began. One soldier picked up his rifle, looked through the scope, and the scope immediately fell off. It had been attached, Vethal realized with some disbelief, using a gray adhesive strip the humans called duct tape. The soldier caught the scope before it hit the ground, looked at it for a moment, shrugged, pressed it back onto the rifle, wrapped more tape around it, and raised the weapon again. He fired. He hit the target, perfectly. Center mass, from 250 meters away, with a scope held on by tape. Vethal stared at his screen. He wrote, "Unclear if this was skill or an accident. We'll observe further." The next day brought the discovery that this was a regular garrison unit, basic soldiers, assigned to a low-priority base. Zelith suggested that perhaps the elite forces would be more in line with expected military behavior. Vethal agreed. He redirected his sensors toward a special operations training facility 300 kilometers north. The elite forces were worse. Vethal spent 20 minutes watching a 12-man team of what were apparently the most highly trained soldiers on the base. 3 of them were napping on the grass in the sun. 2 were playing a card game. 1 was sitting alone under a tree reading a small, battered book with a cracked spine. Their squad leader was sitting on a crate, eating something wrapped in foil. The translation software identified it as a gas station burrito, which Vethal did not fully understand, and he was also reading a book. Nobody was training. Nobody seemed particularly alert. They looked, if Vethal had to describe them honestly, like a group of people waiting for a bus. Then one of Vethal's crew members accidentally triggered a test function on the sensor array, which sent out a brief electromagnetic pulse. It was harmless. It lasted half a second. Every single soldier on that field was on their feet in under 2 seconds. The card game was gone. The books were gone. The burrito was gone. All 12 men were in defensive positions, weapons ready, eyes scanning in disciplined arcs. Nobody spoke loudly. The squad leader was already moving his people into a perimeter pattern. The whole field went from sleepy and relaxed to combat-ready faster than Vethal had ever seen any unit move, including Concord Special Forces, with twice the training time. Then the pulse faded. Nothing followed it. The soldiers waited 30 more seconds, scanning. Then the squad leader made a quiet hand signal, and they all stood down. The card game came back out. Someone found the burrito. The man under the tree found his page. Vethal sat in his chair for a long time without writing anything. Zelith broke the silence first. "Should I flag this for the medical department, sir?" The behavioral inconsistency could indicate some kind of... "No," Vethal said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he wrote in his field notes, "The subject species is not disordered. They are resting. There is a difference. I did not initially understand the difference. I am beginning to understand it now." He spent the rest of the week watching. He watched morning formations where soldiers complained loudly about being awake and still ran their exercises without anyone giving up. He watched a weapons maintenance session where a soldier fixed 3 different broken pieces of equipment with what appeared to be creativity rather than proper tools, and every fix worked. He watched a night drill where a unit navigated total darkness across rough terrain without a single light, quiet as shadows, and then emerged on the other side laughing about something one of them had tripped over. He watched them argue with each other, loudly and freely, and then work together seamlessly 10 minutes later as if the argument had never happened. He watched them eat strange food, and play loud games, and sleep anywhere on floors, on vehicle hoods, against walls, and wake up ready to move with no visible transition period. At the end of the 2 weeks, Vethal looked at his notes. He had expected to write 3 pages. He had 40, and he had not yet reached a conclusion. He sent a message to the Concord requesting an extension. His final note for the first observation period read, "I have watched 42 species prepare for war. I know what readiness looks like. I know what danger looks like. I am not certain I have the correct words yet for what the humans look like, but I will find them. I think it is important that I do." He closed the file and looked out at the pale yellow desert below. Somewhere down there, a soldier was probably taping something back together, and it was probably going to work. The border skirmish at Kale 7 was not supposed to last more than 30 minutes. That was the plan. A clean, quick show of force. 3 Concord patrol ships would move into the contested mining sector, broadcast a formal warning to the human colonial defense force stationed there, and the humans outnumbered, outgunned, and flying ships that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, and stubbornness would back down. Everyone would go home. A report would be filed. The sector would be quietly noted as Concord territory, and the humans would learn an early and painless lesson about where their borders ended. Vethal had been ordered to observe from a distance. He settled into his chair with a cup of warm liquid and a fresh data pad. He expected to be writing his conclusion notes within the hour. 11 days later, he was still watching. He had stopped drinking warm liquid because his hands had developed a faint tremor from stress. He had also lost a noticeable amount of the fine ridge fur above his left eye, which his ship's doctor attributed to tension. The first thing that went wrong was the broadcast. The Concord patrol lead ship sent out the standard formal warning in 7 galactic languages, as protocol required. The human response came back in 40 seconds. It was in English, which the translation software handled easily. The human commander on the other end, a woman, calm and unhurried, said, "We appreciate the message. Could you hold for just a moment? We're in the middle of something." Vethal had read that back 3 times. The Concord patrol commander, who had never been asked to times hold times in his 40-year career, did not know how to respond. He waited. 12 seconds passed. The human came back on the line and said, pleasantly, "Sorry about that. Now you were saying? Vethal had written in his notes. They asked us to hold. I do not know what to do with this information. Things escalated, as these things tend to do. The patrol ships moved in. The Human Defense Force 2 aging colonial cruisers, a converted freight carrier, and 4 ships so small they barely registered on the long-range scanners, moved to intercept. It should have ended quickly. The Concorde ships had better weapons, better shields, and better everything, on paper. What the humans had was Lieutenant Carla Dominguez. Vethal would spend considerable time in his later reports trying to describe Dominguez in clinical terms. He would fail. The most accurate thing he ever managed to write about her was a small human with short hair and an expression that suggested she found the laws of physics to be more of a suggestion than a rule. Dominguez was piloting one of the converted freight carriers. When the Concorde ships moved to cut off the human formation, she did something that made Vethal's tactical analyst stand up from his station involuntarily. She flew her enormous, slow, completely unsuitable for combat freighter directly at the lead Concorde ship, not in a collision course, but at an angle so aggressive and so unexpected that the Concorde pilot flinched and broke formation to avoid her. Then she flipped the freighter, a ship that had no business flipping, and used its cargo bay door like a shield, while her engineering team, working in a cargo bay that was actively venting atmosphere, welded mining drills to the exterior, and rerouted their power cells into what could only generously be called a weapons system. It should not have worked. Every calculation Vethal's team ran said it should not have worked. It worked. The Concorde ground forces on Kale 7 had their own problems. They had landed 2 full companies, well-armed and well-supplied, and they expected to secure the mining outpost in a few hours. The human colonial defense forces on the ground numbered fewer than 80, a mixed group of actual soldiers and militia members, most of whom appeared to be off-duty mining workers who had grabbed weapons and shown up. They held for 3 days. They held by moving constantly, using the mine tunnels as roads, appearing in places they had no logical way of being, and communicating in a rapid, casual, almost incomprehensible way that Vethal's translation software kept flagging as possible encrypted shorthand, before he realized they were just talking very fast and using a lot of nicknames. On the 4th day, cut off from supplies and surrounded on 2 sides, the human ground forces did something Vethal had never documented in 42 species assessments. They started singing, loudly, together. A song that, when translated, was about a person who kept falling down, but kept getting back up, which Vethal noted was on the nose, even for a species as straightforward as humans. His ground commander filed an urgent report, suggesting possible psychological breakdown in the enemy unit. Vethal looked at the audio readings of the singing strong, steady, rhythmically consistent, and wrote back, "This is not a breakdown. Monitor, but do not engage. I want to see what this is." What it was, he eventually understood, was simply what humans did when things got hard. They made noise together. They reminded each other. They were not alone. It was, by any metric he had, completely impractical and militarily irrelevant. It was also, he noted with some discomfort in his private log, the most cohesive unit behavior he had ever observed. 3 more formal surrender ultimatums were sent over the next 4 days. The responses from the human commander were, in order, a polite decline with thanks for the offer, a confused question asking whether there was room for negotiation on the terms, and then on the 3rd, the now famous response that Vethal included verbatim in every version of his report, because he could not find a way to summarize it that did justice to the original. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" "We were in the middle of something." They had used the same phrase. Vethal did not know if it was intentional. He suspected it was. He had no evidence. He included a footnote. The skirmish ended not in victory for either side, but in a tactical standoff. Concorde forces pulled back to reassess. The human defense held the outpost, and both sides quietly agreed to stop shooting while their respective governments panicked. It was formally logged as a draw. Vethal filed his field report on the engagement. It was 19 pages. His supervisor sent it back with a note that said it read less like a military assessment and more like a personal record of bewilderment. Vethal did not disagree. He sent it back unchanged. Then he filed for 2 weeks of medical leave. His doctor cleared it immediately. The ridge fur above his eye had not grown back, and his resting pulse was running high. The doctor asked him what had caused the stress. Vethal thought about Dominguez flipping a freighter. He thought about the singing. He thought about, "Could you hold for just a moment?" "I've been watching humans," he said. The doctor nodded slowly and extended the leave to 3 weeks. When Vethal returned from medical leave, he was given a new assignment. The War Council of the Galactic Concord wanted a formal, structured analysis. Not field notes, not personal observations, not 19 pages of what one senior admiral had described, with visible frustration, as you watching humans and slowly losing your composure. They wanted a proper document. Systematic. Professional. A side-by-side comparison of standard Concord military doctrine against observed human behavior. Rules of engagement, combat protocols, battlefield psychology, all of it, laid out clearly in a table that the council could read and use to make decisions. Vethal accepted the assignment, requested full access to 3 months of additional surveillance data from human military operations across 4 planets, and sat down to write the most organized document of his career. It was 53 pages long. There was not a single table in it. 3 members of the War Council had to take short breaks during the briefing. One of them stepped outside and stood in the corridor for 4 minutes before coming back. The section on combat retreat came first, because retreat was foundational. Every intelligent species that had ever survived long enough to reach the stars had learned the same basic lesson. When you are outflanked, when the enemy has cut off your position and your numbers are failing, you retreat. You preserve your forces. You fight again from a better position. It was not cowardice. It was the most rational decision a military mind could make. Vethal had 3 months of data. In that data, there were 11 separate engagements where human forces had been clearly and definitively outflanked. In 9 of those 11 engagements, the humans had not retreated. In 8 of the 9 they had won. Vethal spent a considerable number of words trying to explain this. He kept arriving at the same place. The humans, when outflanked, did not experience the situation the way any other species did. They did not calculate their losses and decide to preserve what remained. They looked at the fact that there were now enemies behind them as well as in front of them, and they appeared to decide that this meant they were now in a position to attack in more directions simultaneously. He wrote, "The human word for encirclement appears to be in practice, if not in translation, opportunity." The section on emotional neutrality was shorter but, in Vethal's private estimation, more disturbing. Every serious military organization across the Concord trained its soldiers to manage their emotions. Anger made you stupid, fear made you slow, grief made you reckless. A calm soldier was an effective soldier. The evidence for this was enormous and old and accepted without debate by every species that had ever fought a war. Except humans. Vethal had the data from a ground engagement on the colony world of Ceres. 4. A human unit had been holding a communications relay against a Concord probe force. The engagement was going poorly for the humans. They were losing ground. They were tired. And a probe drone had scored a hit on one of their positions. The unit's effectiveness ratings, by every standard measure, should have dropped. Instead, they increased. The unit's speed went up. Their coordination went up. Their accuracy measured in number of effective actions per unit of time went up. Vethal had gone back through the footage 4 times trying to find the explanation. He found it eventually, in a piece of communication between 2 soldiers that his surveillance had captured. One of the soldiers had told the others that someone had insulted their city's sports team. Vethal was not fully certain what a sports team was. He understood it to be a group of humans who performed competitive physical activities for entertainment. He did not understand how an insult directed at such a group could increase a soldier's effectiveness in live combat by a measurable percentage. He included the footage, the data, and a note that read, "I cannot explain this. I have included it because I believe it is important." The section on surrender was the one that caused the first break in the War Council briefing. Surrender, in Concord doctrine, was not shameful. It was rational. When defeat was statistically certain, the calculation was precise. The threshold was known. A unit surrendered. They lived. They were processed, and eventually exchanged. The war moved on. This was how intelligent species behaved. Vethal presented the Council with data from 18 engagements where human forces had faced odds that cleared the Concord's own threshold for certain defeat. 17 of those 18 units had not surrendered. He quoted a human soldier from intercepted communications. The soldier had been told, by his own officer, that their odds of surviving the next hour were approximately 3%. The soldier's response, which had been recorded, and which Vethal read aloud in the council chamber was, "That's still a 3%. So what are we waiting for?" The room was quiet for a moment. Then came the section on civilian behavior, and one of the council members stood up and walked out. In every conflict Vethal had ever documented, there was a clear line between military and civilian populations. Civilians suffered in wars. This was unavoidable and terrible, but they did not, as a rule, actively participate. They sheltered. They fled. Sometimes, they resisted in small and local ways, but they did not, as organized populations, decide to simply join the war effort without being asked. Humans, it turned out, did exactly that. Vethal presented footage from the colony world of Kale, 7, taken after the skirmish. Human civilians, farmers, shop owners, teachers, and retired workers had, without any formal instruction, begun quietly supplying the defense force with food, parts, medical materials, and information. Some of them had taken more direct roles. The footage showed a network of ordinary people who had looked at a war happening near them and simply decided they were part of it. And then there was the woman on the northern settlement road. She was 71 years old. She had silver hair and a small agricultural vehicle called a harvester. A Concord patrol skiff, armored, with 2 crew members, on a reconnaissance pass, had come down her road. The woman had looked at it. She had gotten into her harvester. She had driven it directly into the skiff at the highest speed the machine could manage. The skiff was inoperable. The woman walked away with a bruised arm. She had reportedly told a neighbor afterward that she was not going to just sit there. Vethal showed the footage. An elderly Concord admiral, white-ridged and long-decorated, watched the clip in complete silence. Then, he turned to Vethal. "Is she a trained operative?" the admiral asked. "She is a retired schoolteacher," Vethal said. The room stayed very quiet for a while. Vethal closed the section, straightened his papers, and looked out at the council. "I want to be clear," he said. "I am not recommending conflict with these people. I am recommending that before anyone in this chamber makes any decision about how to handle the human species, they understand one thing." He paused. "The soldiers are not the most dangerous part. The Vrex Collective attacked, without warning. That was their way. The Vrex had been expanding for 2 centuries by hitting new targets before those targets had time to think. They did not negotiate. They did not announce. They moved fast, hit hard, and kept moving. It had worked on 11 species before. They saw no reason it would not work again. What they had not accounted for was that their 2 new targets happened to already be annoyed at each other, and that one of those targets was human. The attack hit both Concord frontier stations and human colonial outposts on the same day, within hours of each other. The message was clear: the Vrex wanted both of them destabilized at the same time, hoping the 2 powers would be too busy blaming each other to respond effectively. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that worked against every species that thought carefully about who their real enemy was before they started fighting. The humans responded in 6 hours with a ceasefire proposal to the Concord. The message was direct and short. It said, more or less, that they could argue about the mining sector later, but that there was currently something much bigger hitting both of them, and that they should probably deal with it together. The Concord debated for 9 hours. Vethal spent most of that time sitting outside the debate chamber because he had already made up his mind, and waiting for other people to catch up was not his strongest skill. When they finally voted to accept the alliance, he was already packed. He was assigned as Joint Operations Liaison to a human strike team, Task Force Ember, which was staging out of Neutral Station, Halveth, 9. The assignment came from a senior admiral who had seen Vethal's reports and decided that if anyone was going to work with humans effectively, It should be the person who had spent the most time studying them. Vethal understood the logic. He also suspected it was partly punishment for making 2 council members leave the briefing room. He arrived at Halveth, 9, and was met by Colonel James Park. Park was not a large man by human standards, from what Vethal had learned. He was average height, with short dark hair starting to go gray at the edges, and calm eyes that moved around the docking bay when Vethal came off the ramp, not nervously, just in the way of someone who was always quietly aware of his surroundings. He was in uniform, but the jacket was unbuttoned. He had a cup in his hand. He extended his other hand toward Vethal. Vethal had read about human handshakes. He took the hand and performed the gesture correctly. Park nodded, apparently satisfied. "Commander Vethal," Park said. "Welcome. You want some coffee?" Vethal had also read about coffee. He accepted a cup out of what he considered professional curiosity. He took one careful sip. The sensation was immediate, complex, and not entirely unpleasant, though it was also much more aggressive than anything he normally consumed in the morning. He looked at the cup. "What is this?" he asked. "Fuel," Park said simply, and walked him toward the briefing room. The plan Park laid out was not what Vethal expected. It was not a large, methodical assault. It was not a slow buildup of coordinated forces. It was 3 things happening at the same time, each dependent on the others, with a margin for error that Vethal's tactical background told him was uncomfortable at best. The first was a decoy signal, a Concorde ship broadcasting a fake command frequency to pull Vrek's attention one direction. The second was a mining charge, repurposed by the human engineering team, converted into a shaped breach device that would open a specific section of the Vrek's command ship's hull. The third was Private Torres. Vethal had looked at the plan notes, and then looked up at Colonel Park. "You want 1 soldier to voluntarily be captured," he said carefully. "Board the enemy command ship through a prisoner intake, and disable their communications array from the inside." "Torres volunteered," Park said. "Why would Torres volunteer?" Park thought about this for a moment. "Ask him." Torres was 24 years old, with a wide grin and a habit of talking with his hands. When Vethal found him in the equipment bay and asked why he had volunteered to be fake captured and sent alone into a Vrek's command ship, Torres shrugged cheerfully. "Because I'm better at the sneaky stuff than anyone else here," he said. "And because if it works, I get to say I walked into a Vrek's ship on purpose. That's a good story." Vethal looked at him for a moment. "And if it doesn't work?" Torres's grin didn't change. "Then I'm bad at my job and I deserve what I get, sir." It worked. Torres was brought aboard as a prisoner, gave the Vrek's guard who searched him a calm, pleasant smile that the guard apparently found unsettling enough to rush through the process, found the communications array in 11 minutes, and had it dark in 14. The breach charge went off on the outer hull. The decoy signal pulled the escort ships out of position. Task Force Ember hit the command ship before it could coordinate a response. The battle lasted 2 hours and 18 minutes. The Vrek's command ship was disabled. The attack on both Concorde and human space collapsed without central coordination. Vethal had spent most of those 2 hours and 18 minutes at a secondary tactical station, watching humans fight in person for the first time, rather than through surveillance footage. It was different, seeing it from inside. The controlled chaos of it. The way they talked to each other, short, fast. Almost a private language built over years of working together. The way they made decisions in seconds, that Vethal's training told him should take minutes. During a lull, while the Vrek ship drifted and Park's people secured the breach point, Vethal sat down next to the colonel. He had been carrying a question for months. Since the garrison base, since the duct tape scope, since the grandmother and the harvester, he had found many clinical answers in his data. He had not found a real one. "Why do you fight the way you do?" he asked. "Why the risk? Always the unnecessary, avoidable, dangerous risk?" Park was quiet for a moment. Not like he was avoiding the question, more like he was finding the right words. "Because the people behind us are worth the risk," he said. He said it simply. Not like a speech, like it was just the obvious answer to an obvious question. Vethal did not write that down. He didn't need to. It stayed with him the way things stay, that answer a question you didn't know you'd been asking. After the battle, the human crew gathered on the flight deck. It was a small, quiet ceremony. Those who had been lost were named. There was silence. There were a few words spoken by Park. No announcements, no ceremony music. Just people, standing together, naming what they had lost, and not pretending it was small. Several Concorde crew members had drifted to the observation window without being asked. Vethal stood among them. He did not fully understand the ritual, but he understood the shape of it. He understood what it meant to stop, in the middle of everything, and say, "We remember." Later, alone in his bunk, he stared at the ceiling of Halveth, 9. He thought about Torres walking into a Vrex ship with a grin, because it was a good story. He thought about Dominguez flipping a freighter. He thought about 80 people singing in a mine tunnel when they were surrounded and tired and should have been afraid. He thought about what Park had said. He picked up his data pad. He opened a new document. At the top he wrote, "I have been approaching this wrong." He would explain what he meant in the final report. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Concorde met in full session only 7 times in a standard year. The chamber was enormous, a wide, tiered hall cut from pale stone, with seats for 300 of the most powerful military and political figures across 14 member species. The acoustics were perfect. The lighting was formal. Everything about the room was designed to communicate that what happened here was serious, considered, and permanent. Vethal stood at the central platform with 240 pages of printed report under his arm and looked out at the gathered assembly. He had rehearsed this. He had written and rewritten the opening 3 times. He had practiced in his quarters the night before. He had gone over the structure, the flow, the careful build of evidence and conclusion. He was a professional. He had done this 31 times. He knew how to deliver a report. He put his papers down on the podium. He looked at the assembly. "I was sent to assess the human species," he said, "to determine whether they were a threat or a resource, or a problem to be contained. I am here to give you my conclusion." He paused. "Do not go to war with humans." The room was quiet. "I say this not from fear," Vethal continued. "I say it from something that took me considerably longer to arrive at. I say it from respect." He walked them through everything. He started from the beginning, the garrison base in the desert, the soldier with the duct-taped scope. He kept that detail in deliberately, because it mattered. It was the first moment he had seen something he could not fit into his existing understanding. A weapon held together by the cheapest adhesive material the humans manufactured, used by a soldier who was casual and relaxed and completely confident, and then the shot. The perfect, clean, center shot. He had thought at the time that it might be an accident. He knew now that it was not. He walked them through Kale, 7, through Dominguez and her converted freighter, and the engineering team working in a bay that was losing air, and how they had built something that should not have functioned, and flew it at a Concorde warship without flinching. He described the 80 ground troops in the mine tunnels, tired, surrounded, singing. He described the surrender ultimatums they had refused, and the response that had come back on the 3rd one, which he read aloud in the chamber. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" We were in the middle of something. There was a small sound from somewhere in the upper tiers, something close to a suppressed laugh. Vethal did not comment on it. He walked them through the rules of engagement analysis, the encirclement that became an attack, the anger that became precision, the 3% chance that one soldier had decided was enough. He showed the footage of the grandmother and the farm harvester. He watched the assembly watch it. He saw the moment the elderly admiral in the front row recognized the clip, the slight forward lean, the stillness that followed. Then he talked about Halveth, 9, about Park and Torres and the plan that had no right to work. He did not tell them what Park had said during the lull that felt like a private thing, not assembly business. But he described the ceremony on the flight deck, and the Concorde crew at the window, and what it had looked like from the outside to watch a group of people stop and remember. Then he turned to his conclusion, which was the part of the document that would later be reproduced, quoted, carved, framed, argued over, and eventually banned from public reading in 7 member states, not for being wrong, but for being the kind of thing that made senior military officers laugh helplessly at inappropriate moments. He read it plainly, in the same even tone he had used for the entire briefing. The humans are not the most powerful species we have encountered. They are not the most advanced, the most disciplined, or the most technically sophisticated. On almost every measurable scale, they sit in the middle range of species currently active in explored space. He let that sit for a moment. They are, however, the most dangerous species I have assessed in 31 years of service. Not because of their weapons, not because of their ships, or their numbers, or the strength of their economy. They are dangerous because of a single quality that I have found no scientific or psychological framework sufficient to fully explain. He looked up from his papers. They do not accept the outcome until it has happened. He explained what he meant. Other species, all other species, including the Concorde's finest, had a threshold, a point at which the calculation was complete, the numbers were clear, and the rational mind accepted the result. It was not weakness, it was intelligence. You could not fight mathematics. Humans fought mathematics. Not by ignoring it, not out of stupidity. They understood the odds. They could read a situation as clearly as anyone. But somewhere, in how they were built, in the way they thought and felt and decided, there was a piece that looked at a closing door and chose to walk toward it anyway. Not because they were certain they could get through, but because they were not willing to be the reason the door stayed closed. He read the final paragraph. Of all the species I have studied in 3 decades of service, only humans look at an impossible situation and ask not whether they can survive it, but how they will describe it later. They fight as if the story is not finished. They fight as if the last word has not been written. And in my experience, when they fight like that, he paused. They are usually right. He closed the document. My formal recommendation is an immediate, unconditional, and enthusiastically pursued alliance with the human species. I also recommend that someone contact the Vrex Collective and make sure they understand what they have made an enemy of, not as a threat, as a courtesy. He gathered his papers. That is my report. The vote was unanimous. 300 voices, from 14 species, in favor of alliance with humanity. It was the fastest unanimous vote in the Assembly's history. Vethal was promoted to Senior War Assessor the following month, the highest rank his division could give. The report circulated through Concorde military institutions within the year. It was assigned reading at 6 academies. It was translated into 31 languages. Admirals kept printed copies in their offices. And then, gradually, the banning began. Not from malice. Nobody thought the report was wrong or dangerous. The problem was that senior officers, admirals, generals, decorated commanders with decades of service kept reading certain sections during active duty periods and losing their composure. Stress laughing, the medical reports called it. The grandmother clip became such a well-known internal reference that it started appearing in informal communications, which was considered a breach of operational dignity. 7 member state military commands formally restricted the report from pre-mission reading. The restriction orders noted, carefully, that the report was not prohibited, only that it was not suitable for consumption in the 12 hours preceding any formal engagement, as it may impair the solemnity required for command-level decision-making. Vethal read the restriction notices. He filed them neatly in a folder. He did not comment publicly. In private, he kept one sentence from his own report printed on a small card on his desk. It was not the famous final paragraph. It was from the middle of Part 4, which most people skipped to get to the conclusion. It read, "They reminded each other they were not alone." It was, by any metric, completely impractical and militarily irrelevant. I have been thinking about it ever since. Above the entrance of the Concorde Human Joint Military Academy, opened 2 years after the alliance was formalized, the final line of Vethal's report was cut into pale stone in 7 languages. They fight as if the story is not finished. Somewhere on Earth, in the American Southwest, a soldier in a dusty garrison was probably taping a scope back onto a rifle. He would probably hit the target. Vethal, had he been watching, would not have been surprised. Not anymore.